All right, welcome everybody. So just quick show of hands here. Who is like a hands-on keyboard engineer? Oh wow, okay, that's pretty good. Who's on more of the management strategy side? Okay, cool. So this presentation is probably gonna land kind of right in the middle of you guys. So just to set expectations. So I'm Josey. I'm a senior product manager with Amazon Alexa, which means specifically that I spend a lot of time thinking about how to take the innovations that our team is doing in ML and AI and turn it over in a productized way for folks outside of Amazon to create experiences on Alexa. So we're going to start at a really high level here, mainly because I did kind of expect a mix of kind of on the business side and engineering side. First, we're going to go into like what are interactions in Alexa in general. Then we're going to talk a little bit about multi-turn dialogue because that's pretty key to understanding why we're doing what we're doing with Alexa conversations. Then we're going to go specifically into Alexa conversations and what does it mean to create skills that are designed with conversational AI. And then finally, at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And basically, we'll just get in a big scrum down here somewhere and answer questions. It'll be fun. So in the simplest way of describing it, a skill is a capability that Alexa has, right? From a developer perspective, a skill is a package of artifacts and components that consist of language modeling and code and APIs that allows Alexa to do that thing that you're trying to get it to do. We have, right now, I think the current number is we're sitting at about 90,000 skills on Alexa. And as was mentioned in the keynote the other day, there's hundreds of thousands of developers creating these experiences on Alexa. And advance. Oh, I was hitting the laser. You guys got to tell me when to do stuff like that. So just to give some inspiration here, here's a couple examples of skills that I think are really great in terms of what they're doing. First off, Ocado is an online supermarket. And what they're doing on Alexa is they are creating experiences that allow vision-impaired customers to access online ordering for groceries. We actually see a lot of cases where a lot of the innovation that's happening with voice is allowing access for certain industries or technologies for folks that are traditionally underserved by things like mobile devices and that sort of thing. Beat the Intro is super interesting because they've taken gaming to kind of a new level in voice. They've incorporated voice and matching and social aspects to create an experience that keeps people coming back over and over and over again. And one of my personal favorites here, Mobiquity, and actually just as a full disclosure, I didn't realize Mobiquity was a sponsor when I put the slide together. I just thought this was super cool what they did. They created a voice-enabled drone that allowed you, just through Alexa and a handful of off-the-shelf parts, to tell a drone to take off, land, that sort of thing. Who all here was at the keynote the first night? Okay, cool. So one thing, especially this last one with Mobiquity, there was I think it was the Spot robot that was walking around. And I think we all saw that there was somebody with a big controller that was steering it around. When we think of where voice is going and what's going to happen and how people are going to interact with voice, robotics is one of those things that jumps out as an obvious use case, right? Eventually, when we get to mass adoption of robotics, consumerization of it, it's going to be voice that you interact with these things with. You're not going to have a controller or an app or a keyboard on its back or anything like that. And you can almost see a direct line between what they've done here at Mobiquity in this example and the future of where robotics are going to be based on that Spot thing walking around. Super cool. So there's a couple of different types of interactions on Alexa, two big classes categories. One is one-shot interactions. This is essentially set a timer, turn off the lights, play smooth jazz, right, that sort of thing. This has driven a lot of the adoption of Alexa, and there's a high amount of utility, ease of use, quick payoff. So this has really driven a lot of the adoption so far. However, there's limitations to it. right? It's a one-shot thing. You like, do this thing, Alexa does it, and then magic happens and it's done. What we actually see a lot of the innovation over the next few years going to is multi-turn interactions. So a multi-turn interaction is essentially a back and forth conversation between the user and Alexa to achieve some goal, to achieve some more complex goal. It might start with a one-shot where somebody's like, Alexa, turn on the lights. And then you have this multi-turn conversation to figure out which lights. In this case, we're showing an example of trying to find a movie, right, or find information out about a movie. And this is one of those cases where the interactions be more contextual, more rich. You can get more done. And even today, even though, as I mentioned, one-shot interactions have driven a lot of the engagement on Alexa, as of today, the majority of utterance traffic to 3P skills happens in multi-turn interactions. So now I'm going to go into like what this multi-turn thing is and why it's complicated and why we should all be super excited about what we're doing with Alexa conversations. But first, we're going to talk about what is it right now. Currently, building a skill is heavily focused on interaction model or spoken language understanding modeling. Here, we're showing kind of the two main components of what's in a skill from the SLU model standpoint, and there's intents and slots. An intent consists of essentially modeling all the ways or similar ways that somebody can say a certain thing. And then slots are essentially those variables that you're going to extract out at runtime to run business logic on. When you're creating a skill, you take this whole kind of package of thing, you put it into an underlying engine that does all the SLU modeling, and those models get deployed out onto AWS so that runtime, when somebody talks to a device, it processes through the system. It's not uncommon for even a moderately complex skill to have hundreds, if not thousands, of sample utterances to properly classify intents. So at runtime, what happens is a user talks to a device. That audio is packaged up, sent off through to be run through these ASR and NLU models. ASR is automated speech recognition. That takes the audio and converts it into text. And then it runs through NLU, which looks at essentially all those intents that you provided, those artifacts for intents at build time, classifies that text into a machine-readable kind of standardized format, and then extracts out the slots from what's said, and then passes that kind of normalized payload off to the business logic and the skill to do something with. The key here is the skill's business logic is completely responsible to figure out what to say back to the user. So you do something, you crunch some numbers, you hit some APIs, you figure out what do you want to say, you package that up as a combination of text and SSML. SSML is speech synthesis markup language, and you hand it back to the TTS engine in an API response, and then that TTS engine turns that text into speech and then renders it out to the user. Once again, everything that's happening here is your responsibility as a skill to figure out what to say next. So in a multi-turn situation, figuring out what to say next is the hard part. In a one-shot interaction, super easy. Somebody asks for something, you say, great, done. In a multi-turn interaction, everything is kind of contextual. So I'm going to go through essentially this idea of dialogue management. And that's the term that we give the engine that you as a developer have to build to make this whole thing work. So down at the bottom here, think of A and B as kind of abstract dialogue state. You need to know something in A, and in B, you know the thing you need to know. For instance, maybe movie genre, right? In A, you need to know the movie genre. In B, you know it. And all that you do in your dialogue manager is say, given this state, do this thing. And if you're lucky, the intent, that little curvy thing down at the bottom there with a 1 in it, is what the user does. And if you're lucky, the user does what you ask them to do. So this is just a single turn, super simple scenario. And also, by the way, I'm just going to give a shout out to, there's a session that Paul Kutzinger is giving about situational design, which is a way to design around this concept of given a situation, an abstract state, do this thing, and hopefully the user complies. So you take one of those little pieces and you expand it out, we zoom out a little bit, And what you get is a dialogue, which is each individual dialogue turn by themselves, stitched together from point A to point B. And this is actually super easy to do. Like there's no secret sauce here. Like this is a linear design, a linear implementation. It's actually pretty straightforward. However, in reality, you get something that looks more like this, right? So like kind of this complex state action space where the user can decide to use mixed initiative. For instance, if you ask them to do something and they decide to do something else. Edge cases where maybe you're not 100% sure of what the user wanted or you need to disambiguate. Or situations like in that little 7 loop, which is my personal favorite on this graphic, where the user changes their mind. You're sitting in a certain dialogue state, you know 3 of the 4 things that you need, you're trying to get the 4th thing, and the user changes thing number 3, right? This can totally happen. This is what's hard. Like this is what makes dialogue design and dialogue management a complex thing. And typically what happens is because this is so hard, we end up locking people into linear flows like when you get stuck in those call for support things, right? So in order to make that work, there's a few things you need. First off, you need really robust language modeling. You need to make sure that that interpretation of what the user said is accurate. Skill accuracy is the cornerstone of a good customer experience, and if you don't have it, then essentially you're doing something different than what the user wanted, which is not positive. The second thing is you need this contextual state management, right? And the simplest way to think about it is if the user says yes, what are they saying yes to, right? What do you respond to? What are you acknowledging? And then finally, you need business logic and APIs tied into the conversation. A good way to think about this is, if you think of like an old form that you're filling out to apply for something, it's super painful and super annoying for a user to go through, provide all of the information, submit that form only to find out that they provided something invalid in thing number 2, right? And on the web side, we figured that out by including JavaScript API calls right in the UI, so as you're going, you can correct the user along the way and create that better, kind of more seamless user experience. For dialogue management, you want to do the same thing. Even though you're going from state A in the top, my right, your left, the top over here, you're going from state A to state Z down there. Along the way, you want to include those API calls, so if the user says something that is going to force you to change where the conversation is going, you can do that. So because that's super hard, we've spent a lot of time thinking about it, actually a huge amount of time thinking about it. And that is the primary driver behind what we've done with Alexa Conversations. And Alexa Conversations, as you all probably saw in the keynote or the videos or read in the blog, hopefully, is a deep learning approach to creating natural conversations. Hidden in this text is a little nuance that it also includes an AI-driven dialogue manager, right? So taking AI and trying to decide what is the next thing I could do, right? So that image I had earlier where you've got the little circles and the arrows and the dots and all that stuff, the AI layer is what helps figure out what is that next thing I'm supposed to do to reach that goal in the fastest possible way. And this is what we find super exciting about Alexa Conversations, and it's super innovative, and it's going to be really, really cool. So get excited. Now. All right, yeah. Cool. All right, so now I'm going to show you a brief clip of a demo. You might have already seen this demo once on a very large screen, but I'm going to show you one little part of it, and then what we'll do is we'll talk a little more about what's happening there and how to create that experience. And demo.
Alexa, what are the show times for Dark Phoenix on Saturday after 9 p.m.?
Here are the show times for Dark Phoenix on June 8th after 9 p.m.
Get me 2 tickets for 10:35.
Okay, 2 adult tickets for the 10:35 p.m. show of Dark Phoenix on Saturday, June 8th at Regal Cinnabar Palace Station will be $21. Should I book the tickets?
Wait, how long is it?
Dark Phoenix is 1 hour and 52 minutes long.
Actually, what are the show times after 7 p.m.?
Here are the show times for Dark Phoenix on June 8th after 7 p.m.
Get me 2 tickets for the 7:05 show instead.
Okay, 2 adult tickets for the 7:05 p.m. show of Dark Phoenix on Saturday, June 8th at Regal Cinnabar Palace Station will be $21. Should I book the tickets?
Yes, please.
You will receive an email from Adam Tickets with your tickets.
So this is like both a great demo and not a great demo for this particular talk. And the reason why is because that just seems pretty easy, right? Like you watch that and you're like, yeah, great. Like you ordered some tickets. That's natural. That's what you're supposed to be able to do. You can change your mind. You can adjust things. That's what I would do if I called somebody on the phone. But as I mentioned earlier, with a voice interface, it's actually really hard to do by yourself. Like there's a lot of variability in there. So there's a few things that I want to call out just to like give you an idea of where the magic is happening. First off, this idea of entity resolution and disambiguation. Early on in the clip, the user says, "Get me 2 tickets for 10:35." And if you notice on the screen, like there's like the one place where it says 10:35, you could also just as easily want the user to say, "Get me tickets for Regal Cinnabar Palace Station." What is happening under the surface at the conversational AI layer is there's that entity resolution that says, okay, I've got these 3 entities. One of them has a property of 1035. So when the user references 1035, they're referencing that entity, and I'll pull that and I'll use that in the next turn. The second thing that's pretty cool that's going on is this concept of mixed initiative. So here it's a back and forth between the user and Alexa. And Alexa's trying to get the user to a goal of, which is the user's goal actually, to get the user to their goal of getting tickets. And so a prompt comes up, should I book the tickets? And at this point, the user is deciding to do something different, thinking back to that earlier graph with like the big loops and the arrows and everything skipping around, where they change their mind. They say, wait, how long is it? They want to take the conversation in a different direction, right? And the system is allowing that to happen. They're allowing that flexibility. And then finally, there's this whole context stack of what's happened in the conversation. So at the very end of it, where the user is saying, "Give me 2 tickets," where the user says, "What are the show times after 7 p.m.?" They don't have to say, "What are the show times after 7 p.m. for Dark Phoenix?" That's already hanging out in context, right? So that context is automatically pulled in, and Alexa is able to respond with that information that was already included in the session. So all of that's super cool, but once again, it probably could be done. Like you could do it if you've got a million monkeys with keyboards and an infinite amount of time, like you could do it. But one of the cool things about Alexa Conversations is it allows you to do that with much less code and effort. So specifically, if we look at kind of the pre-Alexa Conversations implementation of that same experience, we had a skill that essentially had about 1,600 lines of interaction model, and that's that SLU modeling stuff, so intents and slots and all of that. And about 5,500 lines of code to manage state and select a prompt and send that to the user. With Alexa Conversations, we were able to recreate that same experience with much less modeling data, right? So this is a combination of annotated dialogues and entity definitions. Took that down to about 440 lines. There's some new stuff in there, which we'll get into in a little bit, but about 150 lines, give or take, of API definition. And I'll explain exactly what it is in a minute or two here. About 370 lines of NLG templates. So that's templatizing what is Alexa going to say back to the user, and there's some really fancy stuff happening there that keeps it from being far more than that, which is cool. And then finally, about 1,700 lines of actual code, right, to handle the API responses and crunch data and that sort of thing. So all in all, using the conversational AI, we were able to create an equivalent experience nominally. And in reality, it's a lot more flexible than what was there before in terms of the mixed initiative and the corrections and some of that other good stuff. But far less effort and far less code. And this is going to be much easier in the long term to maintain also. As we all know, more code is painful to maintain in perpetuity. So the big takeaway here is less effort, fewer lines of code, less training data. And that is one of the things that we are the most excited about here. So what does design look like in a world of conversational AI? If you've already built a skill once, who's built a skill, by the way? Holy cow, man, that's a great audience. If you've already built a skill once, it starts with the design phase, and then you go through and you create all these language modeling artifacts, and then you write your code. With conversational AI, the design process is very different. And we've done that on purpose because what we want to do is not only make the skills more conversational, to make the design more conversational. So we start with this concept of sample dialogues, and then from the sample dialogues, you start annotating. You take an end-to-end conversation, like that first example I showed of a multi-turn dialogue, and then you start identifying what are the entities in here, what are the things that are valuable for the business logic, valuable for the conversation, what am I going to be switching the direction of the conversation based on. That's your entities. Then you start annotating where are the hooks for business logic in this conversation. And then finally, in the responses, you pull those out and you start tagging them with markup to generate prompt templates. And this is really cool because you don't have to do it for every single version of the conversation. So let's go really quickly into each one of these. Probably not that quickly, but relatively quickly. All right, so sample dialogues. This is the same screenshot that I had earlier, or the same shot I had earlier of a multi-turn conversation. And this is what we really want to start with. We want to put developers in a place where they can think of what are the key interactions I want my users to have. And I'm going to start there, and I'm going to expand out my user experience from there. So what you do as a developer is you go through and you say, okay, here's my surface form conversation between Alexa and the user. And it's just a turn by turn. As I mentioned earlier, you don't actually have to think of every single permutation of this. The key thing is to come up with like 3 to 5 key dialogues for every key function that you want for your skill. And then obviously if you want very specific interactions, you can add those and tune them. This is probably what you'd show if you had to, this is what you would come up with if you had to show stakeholders what is this experience I'm building. Then we go through and we start saying, okay, what are the entities? And so here in this particular, I'd like to watch an action movie. We'd call action action a genre entity, and we just start marking those up. This is really similar to slots today, by the way, with one big difference. Entities can be hierarchical. So if you think of, for instance, a movie entity, that movie probably has a genre, it probably has a time, it probably has a title, it probably has an actor, it probably has a rating. So what you can do is you define those entities, and then when the user provides an utterance that triggers one of those aspects, like we showed, this is that entity resolution thing I showed earlier, when they reference the time, the conversational AI is able to reach in and say, great, I've got an entity with that time, so that thing matches. And now I'm going to go ahead and pull this whole entity over and use that in the rest of the conversation. So that's the one big difference between this and slots, if you're already familiar with slots. And so I mentioned providing hooks for business logic within the conversation. And here, I think the key thing is we've really tried to design this in a way where as much as possible you can take the existing APIs that you already have, that you're already using to drive your web experience, your mobile experience, pull that in, annotate your conversations with them, and that'll set up the conversational AI to, at a certain point in the interaction with the customer, say, great, I'm going to hit my recommend movie API. And you have to provide a definition of the API, right? But that just means that you provide that definition, you say my API takes these things, it returns these things, and I want you, Alexa, to call it when this happens. So that's what this annotation looks like. And this is one of the places where we see a big effort savings between the standard skill implementation and the Alexa Conversations implementation, because here you can just set it up to call as needed. And then finally, you go through and you define your NLG templates. So this is This is essentially where you're teaching Alexa how to respond to the user, right? So here you can see we've taken this, you might like The Dark Knight, and we've templatized it, and we've said, okay, you might like movie recommendation. Now, the obvious thing that you might be thinking of is like, hey, that's great, but what if there's 2 movie recommendations? Or what if I have plurals? Or what if there's gender-specific responses I have to provide? There's a lot of flexibility in these templates. And as a matter of fact, the way it actually works at runtime is the user says something, you trigger that API that you included in the definition, API selection happens, calls whatever the API endpoint is that you've specified, you respond back with the defined payload, and then what happens is you can have multiple templates for each API response. It's not one-to-one. We're not expecting that you're going to have a very linear experience that always says the same thing in the same way every time. We're actually expecting a lot of variability here. And so as template selection runs, you can look at variables like a template if you have 2 recommendations or 3 recommendations. One of the things that the NLG templates do is it automatically handles the pluralization for you. So if you have one thing, it'll say the singular version. If you have multiple things, it'll handle the pluralization. The other thing that happens here, and actually we were just talking to one of our potential preview partners earlier, is there's cases where you have to pull together what you're going to say at runtime, where you can't templatize it at build time, or if you do, it's just not going to provide the best user experience. Maybe your API is looking up a weather forecast, right? Or maybe it's pulling up like a famous quote from somebody, right? And you really need to get that at runtime from your API. You can actually provide a template that the only content it has is that variable you're going to send back. So you have complete flexibility here to either do what you do today, which is basically pull together your responses at runtime, or have pre-templated responses where you're just going to take certain content, drop it in, and then let the rest of the template run. So you do all of this, and it generates this very readable, super simple markup. But this is essentially just it. All we've done is you take that surface form conversation, and you take what is the user saying, and then you add all of the annotation from what are the APIs, what are the entities, what are the NLG templates I want to call. And this is the artifact that gets sent off to the underlying engine and builds those models for you. This is the one where I think in Rohit's speech, he mentioned that we went from the 800 lines of, or 800 samples in the pre-conversations version to 13 sample dialogues for the Alexa Conversations implementation. And it's basically 13 of these guys. So, but because not a lot of people want to sit there and hand chisel these out of wood and stone and that sort of thing, we've actually created a nice, handy user interface that can be used. And this is going to be we've got a preview for Alexa Conversations to make this accessible to non-engineering types or just folks that don't feel like learning a new markup language. So this is an interface that we have that you go through. You start with that surface form conversation, and you start doing the entity manipulation here. So that's all build time stuff, right? That's like, what do I do when I'm sitting down, I'm trying to create this experience? But as we all know, from an engineering standpoint, the build time is half of the developer experience. At runtime, what's happening is the Alexa Conversation Engine is handling all of the back and forth between the user and the conversation engine, actually. You'll notice here, like we've specifically shown that there's not as many API calls as turns in the conversation because those API calls are only happening at the predefined points where you've identified it within the build time. So you could have a conversation where you are getting maybe for every 5 turns you get 3 API calls. You could have an experience where you have maybe 5 API calls for 3 turns, right? The key here is that these API calls are stateless. So You don't have to be tracking the actual state of the conversation. The conversational AI is tracking that. So as this conversation is going forward, from a developer experience standpoint, you're just getting these stateless API calls that you're responding to with data. Now, obviously, you have the option if you want to be tracking that data in that state in the back end of your system. It might make sense to do that in some situations, but you don't have to. And the conversational engine is handling all of that state for you. The other thing is, I mentioned way earlier on, this is like the tie-in back to slide 1, that there's already 90,000 skills out there, right? We fully realize that there are a lot of developers out there that have invested in Alexa, and we want to make sure that the advantages and flexibility of Alexa Conversations is able to be adopted by those skills so we can get those experiences in the hands of as many customers as possible, as many end users as possible. So we've included the capacity to incrementally adopt Alexa Conversations as an AI-driven DM within an existing skill. And what that looks like is at runtime, you can handle whatever your inbound intents and slots and all that stuff is that you normally would. And at a certain point, based on your business logic, you can decide to trigger the new experience that you've added to your skill. And essentially, you respond back with a signal that hands control of that multi-turn CX over to the conversational AI. And then once that transition happens, you'll start getting those API calls that you've annotated earlier in the process. So as we mentioned earlier, we are firing up a private preview or a developer preview for Alexa Conversations. What we're looking for is we're looking for developers that will work with us, work with our teams to refine some of these interfaces, to test use cases, to help us identify what is going to really resonate with both customers and developers, and get ready for an eventual, obviously, public preview. For folks who sign up for this, they're going to be able to work directly with the engineering teams and the tech teams that are driving these decisions. And we are looking for partners that want to release live experiences using Alexa Conversations in the next few months. So also a word of warning on this link, it's going to take you to a page, and there's a call to action that is relatively small. It's kind of like there's a 3-column thing. In the 3rd column on the right, there's a call to action to sign up for the preview. So that's where you got to go. So if you click on it and you think you're in the wrong place, look a little closer, bottom right, and sign up. And then obviously, we'll be contacting selected developers relatively quickly. So that is my content. I'll be right over here to take questions. Yeah.